The crunch of snow under the tires of his aging pickup truck was the only sound that had accompanied Arthur Vance for the last 4 hours. It was a lonely sound, a rhythmic, grinding protest against the relentless December storm that had turned the highways of upstate New York into a treacherous white desert. Each mile had been a small battle, a tense negotiation between worn-out rubber and slick, unforgiving ice. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his eyes strained from peering into the hypnotic swirl of white that the headlights barely managed to penetrate. This was a journey of love, a pilgrimage to the one light left in his life. His daughter, Sarah. It was Christmas Eve, and for the first time in 5 years, she had invited him to spend it at her home. Not his home, the quiet, secluded cabin he had built with his own hands after Martha passed, but hers, her new life. The invitation had been a beacon of hope in the quiet solitude of his existence, a chance to bridge the widening gap that had silently grown between them. He imagined her smile, the way her eyes would light up the same way they did when she was a little girl opening her presents under the tree. He had one such present on the passenger seat beside him, a small, clumsily wrapped box. It contained a hand-carved robin, its head cocked as if listening for a song, a perfect replica of the ones that visited his bird feeder every morning. It was humble, a piece of his quiet world offered to hers. He finally saw it, a glow of warm light through the blizzard, the outline of a large, modern house he'd only ever seen in pictures. It was a palace of glass and sharp angles, a stark contrast to the rustic world he inhabited. As he pulled into the long, paved driveway, he felt a pang of something he couldn't name. It was a feeling of being an anchor from an old world, about to be dropped into a shimmering, unfamiliar sea. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the howl of the wind. The cold bit at him the moment he stepped out, seeping through the worn fabric of his flannel-lined coat. He felt every one of the 68 years, his left knee, a constant, dull ache from a lifetime of hard work and harder memories, protesting the cold. He grabbed the small gift and made his way to the door, his heart, for the first time that night, feeling a tremor of unease. He could hear the faint thrum of music and the lilting sound of laughter from within. He knocked, the sound swallowed by the storm. He knocked again, louder this time. The door swung open, and for a moment, the world dissolved into a cacophony of warmth, light, and noise. A young man, tall and impeccably dressed in a cashmere sweater, stood in the doorway, a cocktail glass in hand. He had a practiced, easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" the young man asked, his voice a smooth baritone that carried an undertone of impatience. Behind him, Arthur could see his daughter, Sarah, her face flushed, laughing at something another guest had said. She hadn't seen him yet. I'm Arthur Vance," Arthur said, his own voice sounding rough and foreign to his own ears. Sarah's father. The young man's eyes flickered over Arthur's old coat, the worn boots, the simple, snow-dusted figure standing on his doorstep. The smile tightened. "Oh," he said, the single word dripping with condescension, so profound it was almost an art form. "Right, the father. Sarah mentioned you might brave the storm. I'm Damien." He didn't offer a hand. He simply stood aside, a gatekeeper granting reluctant entry. Arthur stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air with him, feeling like an intruder in this world of polished floors and abstract art. Sarah finally saw him, and her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Dad, you made it." She came over, giving him a quick, perfumed hug that felt more like a social obligation than a heartfelt welcome. "Everyone, this is my father." The music didn't stop. A few heads turned, offered fleeting, disinterested glances, and then turned back to their conversations. To them, he was just another old man, a relic from a different time, standing awkwardly in their midst. But what they didn't know, what Sarah herself had either forgotten or chosen to ignore, was that the quiet man in the worn coat had once commanded the respected generals, had walked through shadows that would make their blood run cold, and carried a silence born not of simplicity, but of secrets. This was the scene that began to break his heart, not with sudden crack, but with a slow, creeping chill that was far colder than the storm outside. It was a chilling realization that in his daughter's new world, he was not a guest of honor, but a curious antique, to be briefly acknowledged and then quietly overlooked. The journey had been long and treacherous, but the final, most perilous leg of it was just beginning. Here in the heart of his daughter's home, a landscape more foreign and hostile than any he had ever navigated. And as the evening unfolded, he would learn just how deeply a father's heart could be destroyed, not by anger or malice, but by the quiet, soul-crushing weight of being utterly and completely unseen by the one person he cherished most in the world. Welcome to our channel. If you've ever felt the sting of being misjudged or the quiet pride of hidden strength, then this is a story for you. We believe that true character isn't found in loud proclamations, but in silent dignity. Join our community of story lovers by subscribing and hitting the like button, and let us know in the comments if you believe the heroes still walk among us unseen. Now, let us return to quiet storm brewing in that house. Arthur was led further into the living room, a vast space that felt more like a showroom than a home. White leather couches, a fireplace that was more of a glass box with tame flames dancing inside, and a Christmas tree so perfectly decorated it looked like it belonged to a department store window. The air smelled of expensive perfume and wine. Sarah, ever the hostess, took his coat, her fingers brushing against the rough wool as if it were a strange, exotic fabric. She tried to hide her slight cringe, but Arthur saw it. He'd spent a lifetime reading nuances in posture, in the flicker of an eye, in the spaces between words. It was a skill honed in places where a misjudgment meant the difference between life and death. Here, it just meant a deeper, more personal kind of pain. "Dad, let me get you a drink," she offered, her voice a little too bright. "We have a wonderful Cabernet, or maybe a single malt." "Water is fine, sweetheart," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't want to be a bother. He never did. Damien, his arm now draped possessively around Sarah's shoulders, chuckled. "Water? A man drives through a blizzard, and he wants water. You sure you're not an old-school teetotaler, Arthur? Or is it that you just don't trust our vintage?" The question was framed as a joke, but the barb was sharp, intended to mark Arthur as an outsider, a simple man unaccustomed to their sophisticated tastes. A few of their friends, a circle of equally polished young professionals, smirked into their wine glasses. Arthur simply met Damien's gaze. "Just water," he repeated, his expression unreadable. He had faced down warlords and terrorists with less arrogance in their eyes. He wouldn't be baited by this boy. He found a corner, an armchair that seemed the least ostentatious, and sat the small, wrapped gift, resting on his lap. From this vantage point, he could observe. It was an old habit. He watched the flow of the room, the subtle power dynamics, the way Damien commanded attention, his voice loud, his gestures expansive. He saw how Sarah orbited him, her laughter a little too quick, her smiles a little too eager. She was performing, playing a role in this grand theater of her new life. A young man, who had been introduced briefly as Leo, caught Arthur's eye from across the room. Unlike the others, his gaze wasn't dismissive. It was curious, analytical. Arthur recognized the look. It was a look of someone who pays attention, someone who sees the details others miss. Arthur gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Leo, surprised, nodded back. The exchange was silent, momentary, but it was the first genuine human connection Arthur had felt since walking through the door. It was a small island of recognition in a sea of polite indifference. His history was not a story he ever told. It was locked away, a lifetime of violence and sacrifice packed into a mental footlocker and buried deep. His life now was about the quiet things. The smell of sawdust in his workshop, the satisfaction of a perfectly joined piece of wood, the silent company of the stars on a clear night. He had been a carpenter long before he had been a soldier, and he had returned to it, finding a quiet penance in creation after a career of deconstruction. His hands, callous and scarred, were a testament to both lives. They could build a cradle or dismantle a bomb. They had held his newborn daughter, and they had held dying comrades. Tonight, they just held a small wooden bird, a fragile offering of love that felt increasingly out of place. He remembered Sarah as a child, her fierce, unwavering belief that her father was the strongest man in the world. He would come home, weary from trainings he could never speak of, and she would run into his arms, her small hands patting his chest. "Did you fight the monsters, Daddy?" she would ask. "Always," he would reply. The monsters had changed, but the fight, he was beginning to realize, was far from over. The real battle was here, under the warm lights of Christmas. For the heart of a daughter, he felt slipping away. He wasn't just a quiet man. He was Colonel Arthur Spector Vance, a name whispered with reverence in halls of special operations. A man who had led missions so secret they were officially denied. But in this room, he was nobody. Just an old man with worn-out boots and a cheap coat. A ghost from a past his daughter was trying to outrun. The pain in his heart was a dull, heavy ache. It wasn't the sharp pain of a wound, but the deep, crushing weight of being erased. And as Damien's laughter echoed through the room, a sound as hollow as it was loud, Arthur clutched a small gift in his lap and braced himself for the long night ahead. A silent sentinel in a world that had no place for him. The backstory of a quiet man is rarely a simple one. For Arthur Vance, silence was not an absence of words, but a fortress built brick by brick over decades of unspeakable experiences. His cabin, nestled deep in the Adirondacks, was a sanctuary. It was a structure of his own making, a physical manifestation of his self-imposed exile from a world he no longer understood, or perhaps a world he understood all too well. Every log was felled by his own hand, every joint carved with precision that bordered on obsession. The scent of pine and cedar was a permanent air freshener of his life, a clean, honest smell that contrasted sharply with the scent of cordite and fear that lingered in the deepest recesses of his memory. His days were ordered, rhythmic. He would rise before the sun, his body, despite the protests of his knee, still attuned to the pre-dawn rituals of a soldier. A pot of black coffee, strong enough to strip paint, would be his first companion. Then he would walk, a slow, limping patrol of his own small territory, checking the perimeter not for enemies, but for the tracks of deer or fox in snow. His workshop was his chapel. Here, amidst the neat rows of chisels and saws, he found his peace. He would work for hours on a piece of furniture, a child's toy, or a simple carving like the robin he'd brought for Sarah. The act of creation was a form of prayer, a way to reclaim his hands from the destructive purposes they had once served. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't believe he was owed any. He simply worked, transforming raw into things of quiet beauty, as if to prove to himself that his hands could still build rather than break. His only connection to his former life was a single, heavy object he kept in a small, locked box. It was a challenge coin, thick and made of a dark, heavy metal, its edges worn smooth from years of being held. On one side was a stark, stylized image of a ghost, its form seeming to dissipate into smoke. On the other, the words, Nemo Residio, leave no one behind. It was the coin of a unit that didn't officially exist, given only to those who had survived missions from which no one was expected to return. Sometimes, late at night, when the silence of the woods pressed on him, he would take it out. He wouldn't look at it, but would simply hold it, its weight in his palm a tangible link to the men he had led, the brothers he had lost. The coin was his totem, a reminder of the immense cost of the peace he now cherished. This quiet, monastic existence was a world away from the life his daughter Sarah had built for herself. Her world, as he was now seeing firsthand, was one of surface and sheen. Damien's house was the very embodiment of it. It was a house designed not to be lived in, but to be looked at. The furniture was uncomfortable but photogenic. The art on the walls was large and abstract, chosen, Arthur suspected, for its investment value rather than any emotional resonance. The books on the shelves were hardcovers with pristine jackets, arranged by color, their spines uncracked. It was a world of curated perfection, of social media aesthetics brought to life. Damien himself was the high priest of this temple of superficiality. He talked not of ideas, but of acquisitions, his new car, his latest stock market win, his upcoming trip to St. Bart's. His friends orbited him, their conversation a competitive dance of name-dropping and humble bragging. They were young, ambitious, and utterly certain of their place in the universe. They judged value by price tags and success by visibility. A man like Arthur, who owned little and sought nothing, was an anomaly, a glitch in their perfectly coded world. Sarah, his Sarah, was caught in this glittering web. He could see the effort it took for her to keep up, the slight tension in her smile, the way she watched Damien for cues. She had always been ambitious, a trait he admired, but somewhere along the way, her ambition had shifted from being something to being seen as something. She had started to believe that her worth was reflected in the life she projected, not the life she lived. He remembered her visits to his cabin, how she would initially marvel at the quiet, at the authenticity of it all, but after a day or two, he would see her growing restless, her fingers constantly straying to her phone, her connection to the digital world a lifeline she couldn't bear to sever. She saw his life as a quaint hobby, a rustic retreat, not as the hard-won sanctuary it was. She didn't understand that his silence wasn't emptiness, but a carefully guarded space, filled with the ghosts of his past. 3. The scene in the living room continued its choreographed performance. Damien was holding court, telling an animated story about a corporate takeover, his voice rising and falling with practiced dramatic flair. Sarah stood beside him, her hand on his arm, her expression a perfect blend of adoration and pride. She was playing the part of the supportive partner to a man of influence. Arthur felt a profound and painful disconnect. He had given her life, taught her how to ride a bike, how to stand up to bullies, how to be strong. But he had never taught her how to navigate this world of empty signifiers and performative success, because he himself did not understand it. He had prepared her for battles of substance, not of style. The observer, Leo, had moved to the edge of the room, near a large window that looked out into the swirling snow. He wasn't participating in the central conversation, but watching it, much like Arthur. Their eyes met again. This time, Leo's gaze flickered down Arthur's left wrist, where the cuff of his shirt had ridden up slightly. For a split second, a faded, dark blue tattoo was visible. It was the same stylized ghost as the one on his challenge coin, an insignia only a handful of people in the world would ever recognize. For Leo's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of disbelief, then dawning recognition. He looked at Arthur not as an old carpenter, but as something else entirely. The knowledge created an immediate, invisible bond between them, a shared secret in a room full of noise. Leo, it seemed, knew the language of ghosts. Arthur subtly pulled his cuff down, his expression unchanging. But inside, the fortress of his solitude felt a slight tremor. His past, which he had worked so hard to bury, had just been seen. In this house of glass walls and blinding surfaces, a shadow had just been recognized. The contrast between his two worlds had never been so stark, so painfully clear. One was a world of tangible sacrifice, of honor earned in blood and silence. The other was a world of intangible status, of validation sought in noise and applause. And his daughter, the person who bridged those two worlds, seemed to be drifting further and further away from the shores of his, drawn by the siren song of the glittering, hollow sea. The heartbreak he felt was not for himself, but for her. He feared she was trading the gold of true character for the glitter of a life that was all surface, no substance. And he, the quiet hero of forgotten war, could only sit and watch, a silent guest at the funeral of his daughter's deeper self. The inciting incident, the moment when the subtle undercurrent of disrespect breaks the surface and becomes a public declaration of contempt, often arrives not with a bang, but with a seemingly casual remark. The Christmas dinner was served at a long, polished mahogany table. The centerpiece was an elaborate floral arrangement that cost more, Arthur guessed, than his monthly grocery bill. Silverware gleamed under the recessed lighting, and wine was poured from decanters. The conversation was light, frothy, a continuation of the competitive social display from the living room. Arthur sat quietly, a rock in the middle of a babbling brook. He ate slowly, methodically, his table manners impeccable, a relic of a military discipline that never faded. He answered the few questions directed at him with polite, brief sentences. Yes, the drive was challenging. No, I don't get to the city often. The venison is excellent. He was a ghost at the feast, present but not participating. Damien, seated at the head of the table like a king on his throne, was growing visibly irritated by Arthur's quiet presence. To a man like Damien, who lived on a diet of constant validation and attention, Arthur's stoic self-containment was a form of defiance. It was a refusal to play his game, to acknowledge his authority. It was a quiet rebellion that Damien could not tolerate. He needed to assert his dominance, to put the old man in his place, to show everyone at the table, especially Sarah, who the alpha was. He waited for a lull in the conversation, a moment when all eyes would be on him. Then he turned his gaze down the table to Arthur, a smug, challenging smile playing on his lips. "So, Arthur," he began, his voice laced with a condescending warmth that was more insulting than open hostility. "Sarah tells me you were a carpenter. Built your own house and everything. That's quaint." The word quaint was left to hang in the air, a small, poisoned dart. "But before that, you were in the service, right?" "A long time ago." Arthur looked up, his forked paws midair. He met Damien's gaze across the polished expanse of the table. "Once," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. The single word was a wall. It offered no purchase, no vulnerability. It was a polite but firm no trespassing sign. But Damien was not one to heed such warnings. He saw it as a challenge. "Just once?" Damien chuckled, a theatrical, dismissive sound. He looked around the table, inviting the others to share in his amusement. "Come on, you can tell us. Must have some stories from the good old days. Were you a cook? A supply clerk? Nothing wrong with that, of course. Every army needs its pencil pushers." The insult was now explicit, a direct attack on Arthur's masculinity and significance. It was a public castration, designed to humiliate him in front of his daughter. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A flicker of protest crossed her face. "Damien," she started, her voice weak. But Damien silenced her with a glance, a look that said, "I'm handling this." She subsided, her gaze dropping to her plate, a silent accomplice to her father's humiliation. Arthur's face remained a mask of calm, but inside, something cold and hard began to form. He felt the familiar shift, the mental click of a switch as years of training took over. His breathing deepened, his focus narrowed. The clatter of silverware, the hum of conversation, faded into a distant buzz. All that existed was the man at the end of the table and the challenge that had been laid down. He thought of men he had known, true heroes who had served as cooks and clerks, men who had run into burning buildings to save supplies, who had held the line with nothing but a broken rifle and a prayer. He thought of the quiet, unassuming courage that formed the true backbone of any army, a courage this arrogant boy could never comprehend. "I did what was asked of me," Arthur said, his voice still quiet, but now with an edge of steel that cut through the room's ambient noise. It was not an explanation. It was not a defense. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unyielding as granite. The simplicity and finality of the statement seemed to throw Damien off balance for a moment. He had expected a blustering defense, an angry retort, something he could easily mock. This quiet dignity was like smoke. He couldn't get a grip on it. So he resorted to the crudest weapon in his arsenal, open mockery. He laughed, a loud, braying sound. "Okay, Rambo," he sneered. The name spat out like an epithet. "Did what was asked of you. Secret squirrel stuff, huh? Bet you were real dangerous with that hammer of yours." A few of his friends snickered, the sycophantic laughter of a court full of jesters. The scene was now complete. The humiliation was public. The challenge had been escalated to open ridicule. And Sarah, his daughter, sat in silence, her face a mask of conflict and shame. She didn't defend him. She didn't stand up and tell Damien that he was being cruel and disrespectful. She just sat there, trapped between the world she had chosen and the father she was allowing to be sacrificed at its altar. That was the moment Arthur's heart, already bruised, finally fractured. It was the pain of 1,000 betrayals concentrated into a single, silent moment. It wasn't Damien's scorn that wounded him. The words of a fool were meaningless. It was his daughter's silence. Her silence was a blade that slid between his ribs, twisting slowly. He had faced down enemy fire. He had endured torture. He had buried friends. But nothing in his long, hard life had prepared him for the agony of being disowned not by words, but by the devastating power of his own child's inaction. He lowered his gaze back to his plate. He picked up his fork. He took a bite of venison. He did not speak. He did not argue. He just endured. The room was thick, with a new kind of tension. The air crackled with the unspoken. Leo, the observer, stared at Damien with a look of undisguised contempt. He then looked at Arthur, his expression a mixture of awe and profound respect. He had seen the ghost tattoo. He had heard the quiet dignity. He was beginning to connect the dots, and the picture that was forming was one of a legendary warrior being mocked by a child. Arthur ate his meal in silence, each bite a conscious act of control. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing his pain. He would wear his dignity like armor, his silence like a shield. But beneath the stoic exterior, a storm was gathering, a cold and righteous anger that had lain dormant for decades. The boy had called him Rambo, a fictional character, a caricature of a soldier. He had no idea what a real soldier was. He had no idea what a quiet man was capable of. The night was far from over, and the snowstorm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break within the walls of this beautiful, hollow house. The immediate aftermath of a public humiliation is a strange and heavy silence. The air at the dinner table grew thick, the previous light-hearted chatter dissolving into a dense, uncomfortable quiet. The clinking of forks against plates sounded unnervously loud. Damien, sensing it perhaps pushed too far and lost control of the room's mood, tried to reclaim the moment with a swaggering arrogance. He took a large gulp of wine, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face as if he had just won a great victory. He had, in his mind, successfully neutered the old man, established his dominance, and put the quaint past where it belonged, in a box, labeled and dismissed. He saw Arthur's quiet continuation of his meal, not as dignity, but as defeat, a weak old man who knew his place. "Don't be so serious, everyone," Damien announced at the table at large, though his eyes were still on Arthur. "I'm just trying to get to know my future father-in-law." Pulling his leg a bit. "You gotta have a sense of humor to survive in this family, right, Arthur?" The question was a trap, a demand for Arthur to capitulate, to smile and accept the joke, and in doing so, validate Damien's boorish behavior. Arthur did not look up. He simply said, "My sense of humor is fine." The lack of any emotion, any hint of anger or hurt, was more unsettling to Damien than an outburst would have been. It was like punching a mountain. There was no satisfying give, only the dull impact of one's own foolishness. One of Damien's friends, a sycophant named Trent who modeled his personality on his host's, decided to jump in, to support his alpha. "Damien's right, sir," Trent said, addressing Arthur with a mock seriousness. "We're just curious. A lot of guys from your generation have, issues. All that stuff you had to see. Is that why you live way out in the woods? To get away from it all?" The insinuation was clear. Arthur was not just old and simple. He was damaged goods. His quiet life wasn't a choice, but a symptom of trauma, a retreat from a world he couldn't handle. It was a classic tactic of the arrogant, to pathologize what they couldn't understand. Before Arthur could respond, or choose not to, Leo spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that the others lacked. "My father was a colonel in the 75th Ranger Regiment," Leo said, his words dropping into the silence like stones into a still pond. Every head at the table turned to him. Military service was an abstract concept to them. But a colonel, a ranger, those were words that had a certain undeniable gravity. "He never talked about what he saw," Leo continued, his eyes fixed on Arthur. "He used to say that the men who had the most to say were usually the ones who had done the least." The statement was a direct, surgical strike against Damien and Trent. The implication was unmistakable. A tense silence followed. Damien's face flushed a dark red. He had been challenged not by the old man, but by one of his own peers, and in a way that he couldn't easily dismiss. "Well," Damien sputtered, searching for a comeback. "That's noble, but not everyone is a ranger, Leo. Most people just do their time and push paper. That's what I was saying." He was trying to reframe his insult as a general observation, but the damage was done. Leo had changed the dynamic. He had introduced a new frame of reference, one of genuine military honor. Arthur, meanwhile, had subtly shifted his posture. He had been observing Leo intently. The boy knew the culture. He understood the code of silence. When Leo mentioned the Rangers, Arthur's hand, resting on his lap, unconsciously curled around the heavy, worn coin in his pocket. It was a nervous tick, a grounding gesture he hadn't used in years. His thumb began to rub the smooth, raised surface of the ghost insignia. He did it without thinking, a subconscious act of a soldier reaching for a familiar weight in a moment of tension. Leo's eyes, sharp and trained to see what others miss, caught the movement. He saw the corner of Arthur's hand, the way his thumb was tracing a small, circular pattern. He couldn't see the coin, but he saw the action. He had seen his own father do the exact same thing 100 times with his own unit coin. It was the quiet tell of a career soldier. Leo's gaze sharpened further. He remembered the brief glimpse of the tattoo. A ghost. He thought about the most elite, most secretive units in the American military. The units that were spoken of only in whispers. The units whose members were, for all intents and purposes, ghosts themselves. A wild, almost unbelievable idea began to form in his mind. He looked at Arthur again, really looked. He saw past the worn flannel shirt and the tired lines on his face. He saw the set of his shoulders, the economy of his movement, the unnerving calm in his eyes. He saw a man who was perfectly, terrifyingly still in a room full of agitated motion. He was seeing not an old carpenter, but a predator at rest. The rising action was no longer just about Damien's insults. It was now about Leo's dawning discovery. The tension was no longer a simple two-way street between antagonist and protagonist. It was a triangle of growing awareness, with Leo as the third point, the audience surrogate who was beginning to understand profound dramatic irony playing out at this Christmas dinner. He was starting to realize that they weren't just mocking a veteran. They were mocking a legend. Sarah, oblivious to this silent subplot, was simply relieved that the focus had shifted away from her father. She shot Leo a grateful look, misinterpreting his intervention as a simple act of social grace, a way to diffuse the tension. She had no idea that Leo was not diffusing anything, but was instead priming a charge that, when it detonated, would blow her entire conception of her father and her own world to pieces. Arthur finished his venison, laid his knife and fork neatly together on the plate, and took a sip of water. He felt the cold weight of the coin in his pocket, a silent friend in a hostile land. The disrespect had solidified the battle lines. The antagonists had revealed their ignorance. And now, an observer had seen the first clue. The quiet hero sat in the lion's den, his identity still a secret, but the walls of his fortress of silence were beginning to show the first signs of a breach. The dinner mercifully concluded, but the oppressive atmosphere lingered as the group retreated back to the cavernous living room. The snowstorm had intensified, its muffled howls pressing against the large panes of glass, effectively trapping everyone in the house together. The sense of confinement amplified the social tension, turning the elegant home into a gilded cage. Damien, still smarting from Leo's subtle rebuke at the dinner table, was determined to reestablish his authority. He decided the best way to do this was to further marginalize Arthur, to showcase him as an obsolete relic in their modern, fast-paced world. He strode over to a state-of-the-art entertainment system, a sleek black monolith of screens and speakers. "All right," he announced with forced bonhomie, "let's liven this place up. I just got the new augmented reality combat simulator. It's hyper-realistic. Trent, you want to go around? Let's show Arthur what the new generation of warfare looks like. No muddy trenches here, old-timer." He tossed a headset and a controller that looked like a futuristic weapon to his friend. The challenge was a calculated one, designed to highlight the chasm between Arthur's supposed past and their technological present. It was another way of calling him a dinosaur, of rendering his experiences irrelevant in the face of their sophisticated toys. Arthur simply watched, his expression impassive, as Damien and Trent clumsily strapped on their gear. He had seen simulations before. He knew their value and their limitations. He also knew that no simulation could ever replicate the smell of fear, the weight of a life in your hands, or the gut-wrenching finality of a real firefight. It was a game, and he had long since outgrown games. As Damien and Trent flailed around the living room, shouting commands and simulated expletives at invisible enemies on their screens, Leo found a reason to approach Arthur. He walked over to the armchair where Arthur sat, a book on military history in his hand that he'd pulled from the color-coded shelves. It was a prop an excuse. "Sir," Leo began, his voice low and respectful, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but what I said at dinner, I meant it. My father served for 30 years. He passed away 2 years ago. He taught me to respect my elders, especially those who've worn the uniform." "Your father was a good man," Arthur said simply. It was a validation of Leo's tribute, a recognition of their shared understanding. "He was," Leo agreed, his eyes flicking again to Arthur's wrist, where the cuff had once more slipped back. This time, he got a clearer look at the tattoo. It was faded, the lines blurred by time and sun, but the image was clear enough. A specter wreathed in shadow. A ghost. 6. "My father collected military insignia," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze intense. "He was obsessed with the history, especially the rare stuff, the patches and coins from units that, well, from units that don't officially exist. 7, 8, it wasn't a question, but it hung in the air like one. Arthur's eyes, which had been resting on the farcical combat simulation, now shifted to meet Leo's. He saw the burning curiosity in the young man's eyes, the intelligent, searching gaze that was piecing together a puzzle no one else in the room even knew existed. Arthur didn't confirm or deny. He simply held Leo's gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The old soldier recognized the young historian's quest for truth. In that moment of silent communion, Leo's suspicion solidified into near certainty. His heart began to pound. He was in the presence of someone extraordinary, someone history had forgotten. He discreetly pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He pretended to be checking the weather, a plausible action given the worsening storm. But he wasn't looking at a weather map. He was typing in a series of keywords into a secure search browser. Special Operations Unit Patch Go Spectre, Unofficial Insignia Special Forces Nemo Residio. 3. The results were sparse, mostly leading to dead-end forums and heavily redacted documents. But then he found it. A deep web article by a respected military historian, detailing the rumored existence of a Tier 1 unit from the Cold War era known only as Group 77, or more colloquially, the Phantoms. Their insignia was a closely guarded secret, but the article described it based on anonymous sources. A stylized ghost, sometimes referred to as a specter. Their motto, rarely spoken but tied to their legend, was Nemo Residio. They were the ghosts of the battlefield, sent on missions deemed impossible, their successes buried, their failures denied. For they were legends, myths. Leo's breath caught in his throat. He looked up from his phone, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe, and stared at the quiet old man in the armchair. The old man who was being mocked and dismissed by a group of arrogant children. The old man who was, in all likelihood, one of the most decorated and deadly soldiers the United States had ever produced. Sarah, meanwhile, was growing increasingly anxious. The party was falling apart. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken resentments. She saw Leo talking to her father and felt a pang of guilt. At least someone was being kind to him. She walked over, forcing a smile. "Dad, are you doing okay?" "Leo, I hope you're not boring him with old war stories." "Not at all, Sarah," Leo said, quickly pocketing his phone. His voice was strained, his awe barely concealed. "Your father is a very interesting man." "He's a man of few words," Sarah said, a hint of long-suffering affection in her tone, the kind a parent might use for a difficult child. She placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "He likes his quiet." "Oh, you have no idea," Leo thought, his mind reeling. "You have no idea what kind of silence he keeps." The rising action had reached its peak. The ignorance of the antagonist was firmly established. The seed of the reveal had been planted in the mind of the observer. And the hero, the quiet man, sat at the center of it all, his true identity a bomb waiting to detonate. The snow beat against the windows, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that seemed to count down the seconds to the inevitable climax. The house was now a pressure cooker, and the truth was about to blow the lid clean off. The tension in the room had become a palpable entity, a silent guest that overshadowed everyone. Damien and Trent had abandoned their virtual reality game, sensing that they had lost their audience. They now stood by the fireplace, nursing drinks and talking in low, conspiratorial tones. occasionally shooting resentful glances toward Arthur and Leo. They felt the shift in the room's gravity, but didn't understand its source. Sarah, trying desperately to salvage the evening, suggested they play a board game, a suggestion that was met with universal lack of enthusiasm. The party was dying, and she knew on some level that it was her fault. Her attempt to merge her two worlds, the world of her ambitious, slick partner and the world of her quiet, simple father, had been a catastrophic failure. She felt a surge of resentment, unfairly directed at Arthur. Why couldn't he just try a little harder? Why did he have to be so quiet, so different? It was this thought, this moment of profound, selfish blindness, that set the stage for the final act. Leo, his mind still reeling from his discovery, felt a sense of righteous anger building within him. He couldn't stand by and watch the charade any longer. He couldn't watch a man like Arthur Vance be treated with such casual contempt. His father, the colonel, had raised him with deep, almost religious reverence for men like this, the true, silent warriors who carried the real burdens of the nation. To see one of them mocked by the likes of Damien was more than an insult. It was a sacrilege. He knew he had to do something. But what? A direct confrontation would be dismissed. He had no authority here. Then an idea sparked in his mind. It was a long shot, a crazy gamble, but it was the only play he had. His father, before he passed, had given him a phone number. If you are ever in real trouble, the kind of trouble that rules don't apply to, you call this number, his father had told him. Don't use it unless it's a matter of life, death, or profound honor. Leo had always thought it was a bit of an old soldier's dramatic flourish. He never dreamed he'd use it. But looking at Arthur, a living legend being treated like a piece of furniture, he decided this qualified as a matter of profound honor. Excusing himself, he walked toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen, pretending he was getting a glass of water. His hands were trembling slightly as he pulled out his phone. He dialed the number, his heart pounding against his ribs. It rang twice, and then a gruff, no-nonsense voice answered. Yes. No name, no agency. Just a single, expectant word. Sir, Leo began, his voice shaky. My name is Leo Garrison. My father was Colonel Thomas Garrison. I know who you are, son. The voice cut in, not unkindly. What is it? Sir, I'm at a house in the Adirondacks. I think I'm in the same room as Colonel Arthur Vance. There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the faint crackle of the connection. Leo thought he might have been disconnected. Describe him. The voice finally said, its tone now sharp, urgent. Leo quickly described Arthur. The age, the limp, the quiet demeanor, and most importantly, the faded ghost tattoo on his wrist. Where are you, son? The voice demanded. Give me the exact address. Leo rattled off the address of Damien's house. Stay put, the voice commanded. Do not engage. Do not say anything. We are on our way. The line went dead. Leo stood in the kitchen, his phone still pressed to his ear, his mind blown. We are on our way. In the middle of a blizzard, to a remote house in the mountains. Who were these people? What had he just set in motion? He returned to the living room, his face pale, his demeanor now one of intense, nervous anticipation. He sat down not far from Arthur and he waited. An hour passed. The awkward silence in the living room had descended into a kind of lethargic stupor. Sarah had given up trying to entertain her guests. Damien was sulking. Trent was scrolling through his phone. Arthur remained in his chair, a bastion of calm in a sea of unease. He knew Leo had done something. He could see it in the young man's coiled energy. He didn't know what it was, but he felt a strange sense of resignation. The past, it seemed, was a tide that always came back in. Then they heard it. At first, it was a low, distant rumble, barely audible over the howl of the wind. It grew steadily louder, a deep, guttural thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. It was not the sound of a normal vehicle. It was a sound of heavy machinery, of power, of something unstoppable carving its way through the storm. Damien and the others looked up, confused. What is that? Trent asked, walking to the window. He peered out into the white darkness. Holy, he breathed, his face pressed against the glass. Headlights, powerful and high off the ground, cut through the blizzard, illuminating the driveway. They belonged to a pair of black, military-grade SUVs, the kind used by federal agencies or special forces. They had navigated the treacherous, snow-covered roads with an ease that was terrifying. The SUVs pulled to a stop directly in front of the house. Their doors opened in unison, and 4 figures emerged into the storm. They were dressed in black tactical gear, moving with a fluid, disciplined economy that spoke of years of intense training. They were shadows against the snow, their forms radiating an aura of absolute authority. The front door of the house, which no one had locked, was pushed open without a knock. The 4 men entered, bringing with them a blast of frigid air and an atmosphere of lethal seriousness. The man in the lead was older than the others, his hair graying at the temples, but he moved with the same predatory grace. He wore a uniform, but it was a simple, unadorned one. On his collar, however, were the 4 silver stars of a full general. The room fell into a shocked, absolute silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The air crackled with new, terrifying energy. Damien, who had built his life around a projection of status and power, was suddenly confronted with the real thing, and it shrunk him to insignificance. The general's eyes, sharp and piercing as a hawk's, scanned the room. They passed over Damien, Trent, and the others with cold indifference. They swept past the stunned and fearful Sarah. They scanned past Leo, who was sitting ramrod straight, his heart about to burst. And then they found him. They locked onto the quiet old man in the armchair. The general's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The hard, authoritative mask dissolved, replaced by an expression profound, unadulterated respect. He strode across the room, his boots making no sound on the polished floor. He stopped directly in front of Arthur's chair. And then, in an act that sent a shockwave through the entire room, the 4-star general snapped to the most rigid, perfect position of attention, his hand coming up in a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. "Colonel Vance, sir," the general said, his voice ringing with a reverence that bordered on worship. "General Marcus Thorne, it is an honor, sir, a profound honor." The climax had arrived. The bomb had been detonated, and the truth, in all its devastating glory, was about to be revealed. The sound of the general's voice, sharp and reverent, shattered the fragile reality of the room. The word colonel echoed in the stunned silence, a title so at odds with the image of the quiet carpenter that it seemed impossible, a tear in the fabric of the universe. Damien's jaw had gone slack, his face a comical mask of disbelief. Trent looked as if he'd been slapped. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with confusion, so profound it bordered on terror. She stared at her father. This man she thought she knew, this simple, quiet man, and saw him through the eyes of a 4-star general. And she saw a stranger. Arthur looked up at General Thorne, his face a mixture of weary resignation and something else, a flicker of the old authority he had tried so hard to bury. He did not return the salute. He was a civilian now. He simply gave a slow, tired nod. "Stand down, Marcus," he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying an unmistakable undertone of command. "There's no need for that here." "There's every need, sir," General Thorne replied, his hand remaining fixed in its salute. His men stood like statues at the door, their eyes forward, their presence an overwhelming weight of disciplined power. The general slowly lowered his hand, but his posture remained rigid, his deference absolute. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the frozen figures of Damien, Trent, and the other guests. His eyes were like chips of ice. "We received the communication," the general said, his voice now cold and laced with a barely concealed fury, "on a channel reserved for matters of the highest national importance, a matter of honor. We were told that a living legend of the United States military was being disrespected." He let the word hang in the air, each syllable a drop of acid. "I must have misunderstood," he continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "because I cannot imagine a world where anyone, let alone an American, would show anything less than the deepest, most profound reverence for Colonel Arthur Spectre Vance." The name Spectre landed like a thunderclap. Leo, who had been holding his breath, let it out in a quiet whoosh. His wildest suspicion was true. Sarah began to tremble, the name meaning nothing to her, but the gravitas with which it was spoken told her everything. Damien's face had turned a sickly, pale white. He looked from the general to Arthur and back again, his brain struggling to process the cataclysmic shift in the power dynamic. The general took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Damien. He didn't know Damien was the main offender, but he recognized a look of arrogant ignorance on his face. He decided to educate him. "Let me tell you who you're in the room with," General Thorne began, his voice dropping to a low, intense monologue that commanded the absolute attention of every person present. "You are in the room with a man who, in the spring of 1983, led a three-man team deep into hostile territory to rescue a CIA station chief who had been captured and was being tortured for critical intelligence. The official mission was a catastrophic failure. 12 men were lost. The Pentagon wrote them all off. But what the official record doesn't say, what was classified until 5 minutes ago when I personally authorized its release, is that Lieutenant Arthur Vance refused to leave a man behind. 7 for 72 hours, with no support, no communication, and an entire enemy battalion hunting him, he evaded and eliminated every patrol sent after him. He located the black site, neutralized the guard with nothing but a knife in his bare hands, and carried a wounded, delirious man 20 miles through the jungle to an extraction point that didn't even know he was coming. They called him Spectre after that, because he was a ghost. He went where no one else could, did what no one else would, and left nothing behind but whispers and dead enemies." The general paused, letting the story sink in. The room was utterly still, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire. Sarah was now openly weeping, silent tears streaming down her face as she looked at her father, a man she had never known. The humble carpenter, the quiet man, was being repainted before her eyes as a warrior of mythic proportions. That was just the beginning," Thorne continued, his voice resonating with pride. "For the next 20 years, every time the United States had a problem it couldn't solve, a situation so delicate and so dangerous that we couldn't officially be there, we sent the Spectre. He dismantled terror cells in Europe, hunted down warlords in Africa, trained resistance fighters in Asia. 9, he never saw medal. He never asked for a promotion. He only asked for the toughest assignments, the ones no one else wanted. The men he served with, the few who are still alive, don't call him a hero. That word is too small. They call him their shepherd, the man who always brought them home." Thorne's gaze was now burning into Damien. "The limp he walks with," the general said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is not from a carpentry accident. It's from a piece of shrapnel he took at his knee while pulling my own body out from under a burning vehicle in Kandahar. He saved my life. He saved the lives of half the men on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He has done more for his country in silence than you or I could ever do with a lifetime of shouting." The monologue was complete. The reveal was absolute. It was a verbal hydrogen bomb that had vaporized Damien's entire world of superficial status and mock authority. The truth of Arthur Vance's life, of his quiet heroism, his silent sacrifice, had been laid bare. General Thorne then reached into his own pocket and pulled out a challenge coin, identical to Arthur's but newer, its edges still sharp. He held out flat on his palm. "Sir," he said to Arthur, "the President sends his regards. He has posthumously awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the men of Group 77. As the unit's commanding officer and its last surviving member, he asked me to present this to you." Arthur looked at the coin, then at the general, and finally at his daughter. He saw her shame, her regret, her dawning, painful understanding. He slowly reached out and took the coin, his callous fingers closing around the heavy metal. It was not a victory. It was a burden, a lifetime of carefully guarded silence, shattered in a single, dramatic moment. He had won the battle, but he had lost his peace. The quiet hero had been revealed, his honor restored, but the cost was a quiet life he had so painstakingly built. And in the ruins of the evening, surrounded by the shamed and the stunned, he felt more alone than ever. The silence that followed the general's monologue was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. It was filled with the weight of shame, the sharp edges of regret, and the vast, empty space between who Arthur Vance was and who they had thought he was. Damien stood as if turned to stone, his face a canvas of abject humiliation. The smugness, the arrogance, the entire carefully constructed persona of the powerful man had been stripped away, leaving behind only a pale, pathetic boy who had picked a fight with a giant and lost spectacularly. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes. He stared at a spot on the expensive rug, his world having shrunk to that single, meaningless point. Trent and the other friends looked similarly chastened, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and fear. They had aligned themselves with the wrong alpha, and now found themselves on the losing side of a battle they hadn't even known was being fought. They were insignificant, footnotes in a story that was far grander and more serious than they could have imagined. But the most profound reaction was Sarah's. The tears that had been streaming down her face were now quiet sobs that shook her entire body. It was the sound of a heart breaking, not for her father's pain, but for her own monumental failure. She looked at her father, this titan, this quiet legend, and saw every moment of her own casual dismissal. Every time she felt embarrassed by his simplicity. Every instance she had prioritized the glittering surface of her new life over profound substance of the man who raised her. The shame was a physical illness, churning in her stomach. She had allowed this. She had stood by, silent and complicit, while a man less than her father in every conceivable way had mocked him. 10-11, she had been so desperate to fit into Damien's world that she had been willing to sacrifice her own father at its altar. "Dad," she whispered, the word a choked, desperate plea. I'm so sorry." Arthur looked at his daughter, his eyes holding not anger, but a deep, weary sadness. He saw her pain, her genuine remorse, and he knew that this moment, as terrible as it was also a moment of awakening for her. She had been shaken from her slumber, forced to see the world not as she wished it to be, but as it was. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acceptance not her apology, but of her pain. It was the most he could offer right now. General Thorne, his duty done, relaxed his rigid posture. His purpose had not been to humiliate, but to correct a grave injustice. He had restored a hero's honor. He turned to Arthur, his voice now gentle. "Colonel, the storm is getting worse. My men, and I can get you back to your cabin. The roads are no problem for us." It was an offer of rescue, not just from the snow, but from this house of ghosts and regret. Arthur looked around the room, at the wreckage of the Christmas party, at the shattered illusions and the shamed faces. There was nothing left for him here. His quiet sanctuary in the woods called to him, a place where honor didn't need to be announced, where his silence was understood. "I'd appreciate that, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice raspy with emotion. He slowly, painfully, pushed himself up from the armchair. The limp seemed more pronounced now, a visible testament to the truth the general had spoken. He walked over to where Sarah stood weeping, and he placed a small, clumsily wrapped gift he had been holding all night into her hands. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," he said softly. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The simple, hand-carved robin inside was now imbued with a meaning so profound it would haunt her for the rest of her life. It was a symbol of the simple, honest world she had been so quick to devalue. Arthur turned and walked toward the door, not looking back. The general fell into step beside him, a silent honor guard. As they reached the doorway, Leo, who had been watching the entire scene with a kind of reverent awe, stood up. "Sir," he said, his voice full of emotion, "it was an honor to meet you." Arthur paused and looked at the young man. He saw his father's integrity in his eyes. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the old, worn challenge coin. For the first time in decades, he performed the ritual. With a deft, practiced movement, he shook Leo's hand, pressing the heavy coin into his palm in a gesture of shared understanding and respect. 12 in Leo's hand closed around the coin, its weight a shocking, solid truth. He felt the ghost insignia press into his skin. He had been given a piece of history, a totem from a legend. He could only nod, his throat too tight for words. Then Arthur Vance, Colonel Spector, the quiet hero, walked out into the storm, leaving behind a house of broken people and a silence that screamed with the truth. The falling action was complete. The antagonists were shamed. The hero's honor was restored. But there were no winners here, only the quiet, painful aftermath of a truth revealed too late. The resolution of a battle is not always found in victory, but in the quiet that follows. As the black SUVs disappeared into the swirling snow, a profound and permanent silence settled over the house. It was a different kind of silence than the one Arthur had carried with him. His was a silence of strength, of secrets held. This new silence was one of emptiness, of illusions shattered. The guests, who had been held captive by the drama, now felt an urgent need to flee. They made their excuses in hushed, awkward tones, avoiding eye contact with Damien or Sarah. They slipped out into the storm, preferring to brave the treacherous roads rather than spend another minute in an emotionally devastated house. Soon, only Damien and Sarah were left, standing in the middle of the vast living room, which now felt cold and impossibly large. The perfectly decorated Christmas tree seemed to mock them with its false cheer. Damien, for the first time, looked small and lost. His bravado was gone, his world upended. He had built his identity on a foundation of perceived status, and a quiet old man in a flannel shirt had demolished it without saying a word. He looked at Sarah, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. I didn't know," he stammered. It was the weakest of defenses, and they both knew it. "No," Sarah said, her voice flat, devoid of its earlier tears. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a desolate calm. "You didn't know, but you didn't care either. You didn't want to know." She looked around the beautiful room, at the expensive art, the designer furniture, and she saw it for what it was, a stage set, a hollow, beautiful prison she had willingly locked herself into. She had been so enamored with the performance that she had forgotten what was real. Her father was real. His sacrifice was real. The quiet dignity he carried was real, and she had traded all of it for this, for him. 14, she held the small, wrapped box in her hand, its simple, lumpy shape a stark contrast to the sleek perfection surrounding her. Carefully, she peeled back the wrapping paper. The small, wooden robin lay in her palm. It was exquisitely carved, every feathered detail with a loving, patient hand. Its head was cocked, listening. She finally understood. Her father was always listening, always watching. He saw everything. He just chose not to speak. The bird was a piece of his soul, a piece of the quiet, authentic world he inhabited, a world of real things, of wood and wind and honor, a world she had abandoned. "I need to leave," she said, not to Damien, but to the room, to herself. "What?" "You can't," he protested, a note of panic in his voice. "The storm." "I don't care about the storm," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I'd rather be in a real storm than in this place." She walked away from him, leaving him standing alone in the middle of his perfect, empty room. She went to the guest room and packed a small bag. She put on her own coat, a practical, warm one she hadn't worn in years. She clutched the wooden robin in her hand as if it were a lifeline. She did not know where she was going. Perhaps she would try to drive to her father's cabin, though she knew the road would be nearly impassable. Perhaps she would just drive until the storm forced her to stop, to think, to confront the person she had become. The resolution was not about Arthur's vindication. His honor had never truly been in question. The resolution was about Sarah's awakening. It was about the painful, necessary lesson that true worth is not measured in what you own or who you impress, but in the quiet integrity of your character. The narrative reflects on this lesson. We live in a world that shouts, that demands attention, that celebrates the surface. We are taught to judge by appearances, to value the loud over quiet, the new over the old. But the true heroes, the foundations of our world, are often the quiet ones. 1516 to the fathers and mothers, the soldiers and the teachers, who do what is right not for applause, but because it is right. They carry their burdens in silence and ask for nothing in return. Arthur Vance, back in his cabin, would stoke the fire in his wood stove. He would sit in his worn armchair and look out at the snow, the challenge coin from the general sitting on the table beside the old, worn one he already possessed. He would not feel triumphant. He would only feel a deep, abiding sorrow for the daughter he had to lose in order for her to find herself again. He would remain humble, a quiet hero who had been dragged into the light against his will, and who now longed only for the peaceful anonymity of the shadows. His quiet life was his real reward, the only one he had ever wanted. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their quiet exterior? Have you ever been surprised by the hidden depths of a person you thought you knew? Tell us your story in the comments below. We often look for heroes in the spotlight, but perhaps the greatest acts of courage happen in the quiet moments, far from any cheering crowd. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of quiet strength and hidden honor, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this message with others. Because sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that are never told. Thank you for watching.